What do you do if you keep your boat more than 20 nautical miles inland and the port that you want to visit is on the North Norfolk coast? Well, you have two choices. First of all, you can leave through Lowestoft and Mutford Lock, but on this occasion Mutford Lock is not working. Or you can go through Haven Bridge and travel through the commercial port of Gt Yarmouth, but on this occasion Haven Bridge is also not lifting. For this journey to work, timing was everything. We'd have to get to Wells at a point where we could get into the harbour, because otherwise it would dry very quickly, which meant that we'd have to leave Yarmouth before the end of the ebb, squeeze underneath the bridge where we had barely enough air draft, push against the heavy outgoing ebb tide against the wind coming out of Yarmouth, which is never advisable unless you know the port well, and then push a heavy head sea the whole way up to Wells and hopefully arrive there on time. There'd been no weather windows for several weeks, but today was the only day where the sea looked kind enough to allow this journey to happen, and then the next window would be 4 or 5 days later, and then only for one day again. So it was now or never. But the important thing was we had a window to get into Wells next to sea. High water was around about 18:30 in the evening, which allowed us to get in from 17:30 onwards realistically. Maybe a little bit before, but getting over the sandbar is difficult. And if you miss it, the only option you have is to find safe haven at somewhere like Boston, or to turn round and travel the whole way back past Yarmouth into Lowestoft and find haven there. As we travelled down the rivers towards Yarmouth, we knew that low water at Yarmouth was around 1 in the afternoon. That meant that we had to get under Haven Bridge before 1 o'clock and get on our way, because 4 hours is not a big window to do a 50 nautical mile sea journey, especially with the head sea, and you needed some time in reserve. Just heading out on the last piece of the river yet onto Breydon Water. It's a windy day. The sea state out there is choppy today, with up to 1 metre waves, which will be, if we do proceed up to Wells, it'll be pretty much on our beam for most of the journey, which is going to be uncomfortable. Breydon Water is a stretch of open water under the control of the Broads Authority now, just before Gt Yarmouth, and it enjoys the fact that it still has no speed limit. This is of utmost importance, because had I not have been able to run Friday night over Breydon Water several times to check there were no oil and no water leaks, and that the boat was in a fit state to proceed, I would never have made this journey, because bearing in mind Friday night hadn't been to sea for more than 12 months at this point. Thankfully, she was okay. But enjoy this short trip over Breydon Water as we approach Gt Yarmouth. Just the other side of Breydon Bridge there's a waiting pontoon, and we stopped here briefly so that we could drop the radar arch down, and then proceeded on to pass under Haven Bascule Bridge. As I previously mentioned, this was broken and not lifting, so we had to make sure that our passage underneath was exactly right, because passing under this at a strong ebb is not an easy task. As we travelled down through the port of Yarmouth, we passed a new bridge which has caused so much controversy just recently, with several people speculating that this could be actually adding to some of the problems causing some of the flooding around Norfolk presently. We eventually passed through the piers and out into an extremely choppy sea. The boat was being thrown around left, right and centre, but I knew that I only had a little way to go before I got to the deeper water and we could proceed on our journey northward. Just a little bit wider than the track that I plotted out, just to keep in the slightly deeper water. It was very choppy when we left Yarmouth, so staying in the deep water is just giving us a much smoother ride. We can just keep planing. I've really trimmed this back now, so I'm out of the supercharger range but just into the turbos, and I've got a little sweet spot here. It's not particularly fast, but it's comfortable, and the autopilot's just taking us along and holding us on course nicely, which is really handy. Yeah, so just staying slightly out of the channel, or slightly out of the course, and the autopilot just correcting us there. It's a little bit choppy, but the boat's coping with it incredibly well, and when we came out of Yarmouth there was about 3-metre waves, so that was quite fun. But we've got about, what, 0.9 to a metre of waves here, and a little bit on the beam, but it's okay, we're managing with that. Just over halfway to Wells now, and that headland ahead is our next waypoint. That's Cromer. To the left we've got the Bacton oil terminals, or gas terminals. That's where the interconnector lines come in from Holland. The gas comes back and forth from Europe there at that point. We're about halfway through the journey, and as we round Cromer onto the North Norfolk coast, we'll pass Blakeney before we arrive at Wells. Sea state's relatively good. It's a bit choppy. 0.9 metre waves, 5-second intervals. They're perfectly doable. We're just cruising along and the boat's pushing through them quite well. That's really good. Now we're going to be stuck in Wells for several days because of the weather forecast over the coming days, so I'm not really worried about that. But this is a good journey. It's 52 miles, I believe, from Yarmouth. Lowest stop 61. Yeah, there's not a lot in between, unless you want to go into a drying harbour of Blakeney. There's not a lot in between, so you have to be committed to go. But we're doing well. We're doing okay. I'm planning to arrive at the bar at Wells for 5 o'clock. That's high water. It's a difficult harbour to get into, and we've got 30 miles to run, so that's about right for us here now. It's 3 o'clock, so it's not a push. 16-17 knots gives us a little bit of time, and something for mum and the kids, if you like, in between to make some decisions if the weather turns a little bit as well. So yeah, all good. In quite heavy head sea now, coming up to Cromer. We're just over an hour to run to Wells, and we really are pushing through this sea. This is hard going. It's really pushing on the nose now, but hoping once we get past Cromer and into the depths of the Wash estuary, we should get a bit of a following tide and help us along a little bit more. That there in the early evening sun is Blakeney Point, Blakeney Harbour, and we're just a few miles past there. I'm we'll find and pick up the entrance point to Wales. The sun's out, the sky's blue, the sea's a bit choppy, but it's been a great journey. Again, it has been a great journey. We've just got to get to that bar before 6 o'clock. The time now, 5 o'clock. And I think we've got 9 miles to run. So we've got to get a bit of a shuffy on. Otherwise there won't be enough water in the harbour when we get there. Just a mile off the bar now, and I'll be giving Wales a call on the radio very shortly. They may not be there. It's a very tricky entrance. You have to follow the passage plan implicitly, otherwise you will run aground. We're making good progress. Around about 20 knots at the moment. I'm anticipating we'll be at the bar at the marker at 17:30, which is 20 minutes after high tide, but will be sufficient for us to get across and get into the harbour.
It's been a long, hard season. I'm feeling weary to my bones. I guess that's my reason. I've packed my bags and now I'm gone. Somewhere between the sun and the deep blue sea, that's where you find me. Tanned and red, flat out on a beach bed, that's where you find me. Working on my fishing skills in a little boat that I rent. Ain't got nothing but time to kill. No vacation's been more heaven sent. Between the sun and the deep blue sea, that's where you find me. Tan and red, flat out on a beach bed. Between the sun and the deep blue sea, that's where you find me. My feet in the sand, green umbrella drink in my hand. So if you must, oh, if you need me, between the sun and the deep blue sea.
Wells is a small fishing and trading town on the North Norfolk coast, originally mentioned in the Domesday Book and with a port dating back to the 1300s. It adopted the name next the sea to differentiate itself from other towns of the same name. It was famous as a fishing and a cargo port, and in the early 1500s you'd see coal arriving at the quay from the northeast, and in return for wheat and bread and malt for their beer. Trade continued well up to the 19th century, where rail started taking over some of the transfer of goods to and from these coastal towns. Wells was also a shipbuilding town as well, and in the 1900s it was building 300-ton vessels, and some 170 of them were built at the port itself, hence the large stone wall. Commercial trade dwindled, but there was a resurgence up in the 1970s, where the large sailing ships were replaced by commercial coasters, bringing fertiliser and animal feed from Europe. It wouldn't be uncommon in the 1980s to see 8 cargo vessels double-banked across the stone quayside. Sadly, the vessels became too large to be accommodated in the very shallow port, and eventually only one vessel, a Dutch sailing barge called Albatros, continued to trade. So this building used to be the Granary, and it was constructed in 1902 and completed in 1904. What's very interesting about this building, apart from the history of being on the side of it, is the tide heights that are recorded on here. There are 2 or 3 high tides, predominantly 1978 being the lowest high tide, the very bad floods of 1953 which affected the whole of the east coast, but then on the 5th of December 2013 an even higher tide. That's above the window levels here, and I should imagine may have caused some damage. And there's the gantry, the overhead gantry for the grain. And that would have had a travelator, I should imagine, in the olden days. Just walking down Shipwrights, which is a right away down to a boat yard, Jolly Sailors Yard. It suggests to me that there were pubs galore down here at one point in time. And so typical for Norfolk as well, these narrow scores, these narrow roads that go up between the houses, away from the rivers and the beaches. And some of these garages even have been turned into most amazing homes. Look at that. And the panoramic view that you're going to get from there is amazing. This is an interesting building. It's called the Freeholders and it's the site of a former public house. But interestingly, it's clad entirely in steel. Like so many other picturesque coastal towns, many properties are being sold to second homeowners and also for investment. This is leading to a declining population, and some of the businesses are suffering as a result of not having the manpower available to operate. Undoubtedly, this leads to shortages somewhere and businesses close. It was sad to see the large chandlery closed. The building looks magnificent still, and I really hope to retain some form of maritime heritage in its usage going forwards. We continue to explore Staithe Street and had a look at some of the trinket shops and cafes before eventually finding somewhere to settle for the evening. So as we sit down together and have a beer, let's tell you the story of the Albatros. The 32-metre sailing clipper has been part of the Wells quayside for almost 40 years. One day it arrived with its skipper as the last trading vessel to be going backwards and forwards from Europe to Wales itself, and stayed on the quay. Later opening as a music venue and offering afternoon teas and a cafe, it traded up until around 2020. But after 40 years, the skipper Tom Brower decided it was time to sell. Built in 1899 near Rotterdam, for almost a century he had been ferrying cargo backwards and forwards across the sea from Europe to the UK. During the Second World War, the crew were commended as they brought many Jewish refugees and political dissidents out of Denmark, and in return took weapons back for the resistance fighters. After the vessel was sold in 2020, it made its way down to Essex, where a full refit was undertaken, and nobody knew what was going to happen with the vessel next. But the town were absolutely thrilled when it was announced it was going to return back to Wales, and in 2023 it sailed back up the channel under the master fly of the harbour master and returned to its prominent berth by the quayside. In the next episode, we'll continue to explore Wales, and we'll tell you of the very important connection between Wales next to sea and the RNLI. We'll also have a look at the amazing beach and the estuary before taking a journey back to Great Yarmouth, which in itself presents new challenges, and then arriving back at our berth in complete darkness.